All right, so let me ask you this. Have you ever been on a flight where the pilot 100% stuck the landing and you barely even noticed that you were no longer in the air? Well, pilots have an expression for that. They call it buttering the bread. When I was a revenue manager, I always thought of cleanly executing a perfect sellout a lot like our equivalent of sticking a clean landing. It was always a great feeling when those weeks and months of yielding, adjusting our pricing, managing our overbooking strategy, and so on paid off, and we finally hit that 100% mark. So here's a question. Why don't we as hoteliers have a cool phrase for when we nail the perfect sellout? I propose that we steal buttering the bread because, let's be honest, I want to see the look on everyone's face in my next revenue meeting when I try to slip that term in. So let's stick with this flight analogy. Think about all the things that pilots are dealing with in even a routine landing. Tailwinds, headwinds, runway conditions, all while having a full conversation with air traffic control. And just like pilots, revenue managers have a list of conditions that we're factoring in as well when we're gliding to that perfect sellout in those last few days leading up to arrival. Things like booking lead time, cancellation trends, market segmentation, and then other things like rate evolution or what our demand drivers are, or even our overbooking strategy. And let's say you get just one of these factors wrong. For example, maybe you're not updating your event calendar and a big football game gets announced and you don't notice. If you've been in revenue management long enough, then you know the embarrassment of selling out 6 months in advance. And trust me, watching the comp set raise rates while you're out of rooms to sell isn't a good feeling. And when it comes to rough landings like this, again, pilots have all sorts of expressions. In fact, if you don't believe me, I got a real-life pilot on the phone to go over some of the fun phrases that they use. This is my buddy Ross. I called him up, and he gave me the full gamut of all the terms that they like to use in the airline industry. Listen to this.
Hey, Daniel, you there?
There he is. Can you hear me okay?
What's going on, buddy?
So this is my buddy Ross. He is a cargo pilot, super funny guy. And if you want pilot lingo, this is the guy you got to go to.
Yeah, I'm worried that I'm not going to give you the gold that you're expecting right now. I got some okay ones, but I'm worried I'm going to disappoint you here.
No. You will not disappoint because we have nothing. So the one that is springing to mind, and this is one that you would always bring up jokingly, was, okay, you nail the landing and you butter the bread.
Oh yeah, I use that one quite a bit.
And thankfully for me, this kind of got the juices flowing, and the rest is history.
We also we'll say we greased it. You don't even feel the landing. It's a greaser. Yeah, catch a third wire. That's a Navy thing. If somebody can't fly, we call them a penguin. You have to we call them a seagull. If they can fly, but you kind of have to force them to. You got to throw rocks at them. You get on the back side of the power curve. We call it being behind the power curve. And that's just a long-winded saying of the bottom guy of each list. We call him the plug, similar to the power curve. But we call it putting smash on the airplane. It's almost in Spinal Tap, turn it to 11. Obviously 8 hours bottle to throttle. Another one, dozing for dollars. Anytime you're you're getting away with something, if the
All right, so it goes without saying that we have a long way to go to catch up to those guys. But hey, let's start right here, right now, with this podcast season and see if we can come up with some fun phrases that we as revenue managers can use when we hit the perfect sellout. So all of this talk about hitting the perfect sellout leads me to a simple question. What's the best strategy to ensure a perfect sellout every time? When I set out to make this podcast, I naively thought that maybe I'd find some kind of universal answer to this question, like a quick and easy landing checklist that RMs could use to always hit the perfect sellout. But once I started digging into the data and interviewing real-life revenue leaders, and also using our suite of BI, rate shopping, and market demand tools, I realized that a simple checklist isn't enough. What I did discover, though, is a framework that you can take and apply to your property to better learn how to approach each and every sellout. And by the way, if you like what you're hearing so far and you maybe want to learn more or see a demo of the Lighthouse commercial platform, please visit us at mylighthouse.com/podcast demo. So without further ado, let's get into it. In part 1, we're going to focus on one main factor that affects sellouts: demand and its effect on the booking curve. We're going to look at a few sellout nights with our guest, Jeff, and some of these nights include a massive Alabama football game with an almost $800 ADR, and then a more routine midweek sellout. Then we'll talk about ways in which these two sellouts were different. If you really don't mind spoilers and you want to jump straight to my 5 takeaways from this episode, just jump to the 21-minute mark. Otherwise, stick around and let's get into the episode. So if we're going to answer a question as broad as what's the best way to sell out, we need to start somewhere. I feel like a logical place to begin is going to be demand. If the demand isn't there in the first place, we're never going to have a chance to sell out at all. And even though sellouts don't happen every night, they certainly can happen when the requisite demand drivers are there. So what are demand drivers? Demand drivers are what they sound like. They're market conditions, specific events, or maybe other factors that create demand for hotel rooms. And these demand drivers can vary wildly, by the way. On the glamorous end of the spectrum, they might be special events like the World Cup or a Taylor Swift concert or something equally exciting. But on the more mundane end of the spectrum, demand drivers can be things like strong corporate demand because you happen to be 2 miles away from a large corporate park. Or maybe you're the only hotel in the comp set with an indoor pool and it's December. And I can't talk about demand and sellouts without also bringing up the concept of the booking curve. We're going to refer to the booking curve a lot throughout this series. So what is it? Long story short, it's how your hotel's occupancy changes over time as you get closer to arrival. To help describe the booking curve, I enlisted some help from our team of revenue experts. I asked them to draw me their ideal booking curve for a night that they know that they would sell out. Okay, so what I'm asking revenue managers to do is draw me your ideal sellout, essentially. So the y-axis is going to be occupancy. And then on the x-axis, you have like days to arrival, if that makes sense. So on the far left, you've got like a full... So this is John Stanfield. He's one of our RMs on our revenue management service team.
We're obviously gonna look just like this.
Okay, so here, John is drawing his curve.
It's a pretty gradual ascent. We get our group on the books, the group picks up.
And notice that John is already talking about market mix here, but don't worry. We'll dedicate a whole episode to just market mix.
And of course, like any good revenue manager, I want to oversell. And ideally, I want to hit this 100% mark 2 weeks out because I know I'm going to have cancellations and I know I'm going to have no-shows.
Okay.
So I'll go right about here, 3% oversell, and just keep that flat. And as almost always happens, once I get right up to the date of arrival, we're going to drop probably below 100%, but then we'll kick back up on the day of arrival because I'll tell the front desk, sell rooms.
Next, here's Chase Collier. Chase is one of the leaders on our revenue management team.
All right, so open up inventory here, 365 days out. Obviously going to start with some rates, that we want to sort of protect inventory a little bit. So we don't expect to see a ton of pickup right away. So we expect, maybe a couple reservations here, a couple reservations there, but it's going to be pretty mellow pickup for the most part. Again, just picking up high rated business through the first, 100 or so days.
All right, so here Chase is drawing this very, very gradual increase in occupancy. And it's obvious that he doesn't want to immediately sell out as soon as he opens inventory.
Perhaps as we get closer in, our sales team is able to lock in a group, get some group business, which may result into a spike up in occupancy right there, maybe 180 days out.
Okay.
And then as we get closer and closer, we can expect to see a little more linear, more, elevated pickup once we get closer to about 90 days.
And this is where Chase's booking curve really starts to take off after he mentions that 90-day window. And this is where he really, draws this big increase in his occupancy.
Depending on the demand of the market, we may be adjusting our rates either up or down to try and get some more pickup going. But ultimately, our goal is, again, to get to that sellout. And then probably once we get to about 14 days, we're looking at somewhere around 80 to 85, 90% occupancy, somewhere in that range. And really, we're just trying to close that final gap. And within 7 days, we're probably looking at right around 90 to 95% occupancy. And then 5 or 6 days, maybe 4 days out, we're basically sold out, or 99%, maybe have 1 or 2 rooms. And even in some cases here, we want to actually oversell our property.
And then finally, here's another graph from another one of our revenue managers, Lexi.
You got to take into account it's just going to get a little bit higher, but you get to 2 weeks, it could dip a little. And then hopefully within the week, I know it's a little off, but you understand what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
Hopefully within the week, then you see some wash, but then by the time it's 3 days, and that's especially if you have a short booking window.
Okay. So you have a lot of maybe select service hotels where you have a lot of kind of last minute bookings, last minute cancellations, more business mix.
Especially when they have groups too, and the groups wash.
So I know that you can't see these graphs, but you really don't have to use too much imagination to understand the chart that they're drawing. We pretty much all draw the same thing. We start with nothing on the books, and then slowly we add occupancy. And once we start to reach milestones that are a bit closer to the arrival date, say 90, 60, and 30 days out, pickup really starts to take off. Something interesting that all of the revenue managers kept mentioning was when they would sell out.
I want to hit this 100% mark 2 weeks out.
And then hopefully within the week,
5 or 6 days, maybe 4 days out, we're basically sold out, or 99%, maybe have 1 or 2 rooms. And even in some cases.
So in short, Lexi, John, and Chase's graphs are all ideal booking curves, which gives us a rough estimate of what we should be aiming for with the shape of our booking curves. And while talking about hypothetical booking curves is great, I really wanted to see some real life scenarios to see exactly how demand affected real life booking curves and how RMs were adapting to differing levels of demand in the real world. I put out the feelers with our revenue management team and asked if anyone had any good recent sellouts that they could show me. Thankfully, it didn't take too long to find a great example.
And we identified this weekend very early on as this will be our busiest weekend we've ever had.
So that's Jeff. He's a director of operations for our revenue management team. He recently had 2 perfect sellouts at one of his hotels that he was willing to show me. One was a huge college football game that had recently rolled into town. This was a really big night, maybe the biggest citywide event that this market had seen in possibly 2 to 3 years, and very high stakes from a revenue management perspective. The second night that he showed me was another sellout night, but it was much more routine. It was just a Wednesday night with strong corporate demand. Also, just as a qualifier, on both of these nights, Jeff had really strong performance, especially for the college football game. Before I jumped on a video call with Jeff, I took a look at both of these sellouts in Lighthouse Business Intelligence and Rate Insight and put together a few questions about his booking curves and the strategies that he implemented. Right off the bat, something caught my eye. For the big college game night, he achieved high occupancy much earlier in the booking curve than I would have guessed. For that night, Jeff got his hotel to a technical sellout, or 95% occupancy or higher, 48 days from arrival, only reaching the perfect sellout 14 days from arrival. My initial reaction was, wow, he sold out way too early. But when I got a chance to talk to Jeff, he clarified some of the logic behind his booking curve.
So, as you mentioned, this was a college football game, so it definitely played a factor into the timeline of this. You can see right about 45 days out is right when colleges are starting back to school. Mm-hmm. So that we were kind of knew this would be when we start to see a large amount of pickup over these dates. Kind of perfect storm. It was hitting early October where the weather is nice in Texas. It's not always nice in this city. So it's in the perfect time of year. Perfect opponent was coming. So we just kind of knew, like I said, a perfect storm of factors were happening on this weekend. So we expected about a 45, 35 day lead time on the sellout.
Notice here that Jeff mentions the extreme level of demand and some other factors that are augmenting that demand. Renewed interest in college football due to kids going back to school, the opponent, and other factors like weather. He specifically mentions that selling out this early was indeed intentional. I can't stress the importance of recognizing these events early enough. Executing a successful sellout with strong RevPAR and ADR performance will be almost impossible to do if you aren't able to spot events quickly enough and implement strategies to control your booking curve. Shifting gears back to the interview, I next asked Jeff a question about another trend that I had seen. Rates for this event were really high in the market. We're talking in excess of $1,000 high. And when the hotel reached the technical sellout, their occupancy didn't just stay static. Doing some deeper analysis and revenue insight, cancellations remained a constant challenge throughout the booking curve. So Jeff had to price the hotel in such a way that he maintained strong ADR performance, but could still realistically expect to replace rooms in the event that guests did cancel.
A lot of factors went into pricing this weekend, and it really was a trust the process. I kept trying to tell the hotels, just trust this process. I promise you this is going to work. We actually slowly built up our price. Like we started high. I think we started probably somewhere around the mid 700s. And then we worked our way up to, like you said, above $1,000 per night by the time we were into the weekend of the game.
Expanding on this a bit further, in the final 40 days leading up to arrival, the hotel only had a net positive pickup of 2 room nights, meaning it experienced 10 canceled room nights and 12 newly booked room nights. I think this really reinforces Jeff's decision to sell out earlier in the booking curve. These highly rated rooms can be a pain to replace. But imagine if he had been aiming to sell out only 7 days before. To me, it looks like this wouldn't have even been possible. At least not without compromising strategy somewhere else, like lowering rate to fill last minute, which likely would have led to lackluster results. In the second part of our conversation, we shifted gears a bit and took a look at a way more tame sellout night. I don't want to downplay it too much because he still hit a perfect sellout, but you'll soon realize just how different it was.
This was a day where there was not a citywide going on. And if you look like the day before, the day after, you can see we didn't sell out either one of those days. But
this particular night was a sellout about a month prior to the football game. This was a lot more routine midweek night, but listen to the ways in which this night was different.
About 2 weeks prior, I guess, we really started to see quite a bit of takeoff on, I don't want to call it a curve, on that peak.
For a start, the booking curve was completely different. And for this night, the hotel shot up in occupancy from 75% to 100% in just the final 7 days. The first night had a big citywide event, whereas the second night did not. The pricing strategy was very, very different. Jeff yielded completely differently and had a different set of house policies. To state it plainly, the stakes were generally much lower for this second sellout. Jeff also made a comment about nights just like this, where demand is high, but nothing like a citywide level demand.
Now, if it's not a guarantee, then you also want to start yielding out later upfront, take everything you can.
One thing that my conversation with Jeff illuminated was that different levels of demand and the specific demand drivers behind the demand can create very different types of sellouts. For the big college game night, it was much more beneficial to sell out earlier in the booking curve and allow a bit more runway for Jeff to butter the bread. On the second night, There was much more of a let's take what we can get attitude that allowed the hotel to sell out, but in a much different way. If you want to see just how different these booking curves were, that's included in the blog, so be sure to check the link in the description so you can see some of these fun visuals. So what are our 5 takeaways from this first episode? First, be sure to catch events early enough to fully control the booking curve. My second point is for potential sellouts with excessively high demand, think major event dates like the football game that we talked about with Jeff, time spent at or above the technical sellout before the day of arrival isn't always a negative. The third takeaway is to consider a longer runway for extremely high demand event dates. If you're used to sweating it out and selling out day of, consider starting small and aiming to sell out a few days before. Then, take note of the effects that it has on your property's performance. The fourth takeaway is that dates with more routine demand drivers don't need as much runway. Pickup is generally going to be more last minute, and you don't have to be as restrictive. The final point is don't just revenue manage based on what your occupancy is that morning. Be more visual and imagine where you are along the booking curve. Are you behind same time last year pace? Are you seeing a massive spike in your booking curve that's making you uncomfortable? Think about strategies that you can implement now to modify the trajectory of your booking curve that will ultimately lead to 100% occupancy for the final day of arrival. Coming up in part 2, we're going to touch on rate evolution, as the way that you price is one of the easiest and most obvious levers that you can pull to start controlling your booking curve and hitting the perfect sellout. And don't forget, if you'd like to learn more about the tools that I mentioned in this episode, visit us at mylighthouse.com/podcast demo to request your personalized demo of the Lighthouse commercial platform.